Matt, good to see you. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Daniel. I'm excited to dig into this topic today.
So, I've gotten to know you a little bit, but for folks who do not know you or do not come from maybe the Philadelphia charter area, give us the quick background on who you are and what you're up to today.
Yeah, so I started in K-12 education in 2003. I was a teacher in Philadelphia public schools, and then moved on in 2007 to join Mastery Charter Schools. Mastery is based in Philadelphia and Camden, New Jersey. At that time, we had three schools. Now Mastery has 24, and I'm going to say we because I was with Mastery for 18 years, and so it's still hard for me to break that habit of saying we, but I held a number of positions at Mastery, school-based leadership positions, but spent most of my career as the regional superintendent of Mastery's high schools. And most recently at Mastery, I was the chief operating officer. I left Mastery after 18 great years back in February, did some consulting work for the last few months, and then I joined Timely. And Timely is an ed tech company that has a master scheduling solution that pairs an AI optimizer with expert scheduling support to save time, money, and make sure more kids get the courses they need.
Perfect. Well, that's the we're pulling the curtain back immediately on the topic for today, which is master scheduling. And I'm excited to dive into this because every once in a while I'll sit down with a leader, bump into someone and say, "Hey, what's going on? What are you working on right now?" And they'll say, "Oh, the master schedule. It's a disaster." Why do you think scheduling season is like the least favorite time of the year for some people, or maybe for a lot of people? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, we're on it. It is here, or if it's not here, it's coming up shortly. And look, I felt the same way for years. Here's the thing: we have professionalized almost every aspect of school operations over the past couple decades. We have CRMs for enrollment. We didn't have those 15, 20 years ago. We have better financial forecasting tools. We have project management platforms like Asana. All of it has become more sophisticated. But when it comes to master scheduling, most folks are still using tools that haven't evolved in 15 or 20 years. Maybe Excel spreadsheets have become Google Sheets, but for the most part, it's a lot of spreadsheets. It's a lot of tiles on magnetiles, on whiteboards, and sticky notes. Even the student information systems that have scheduling functions, most of that is so far downstream, it can't truly optimize for a school or a network's most important goals. And so that makes for long, laborious, I would argue, unfulfilling process. So we shouldn't be surprised that leaders dread it.
Yep, makes a ton of sense. So where does the master scheduling function really begin? Because my understanding, which is extremely limited, is that this is one of those things that is really cross-functional for the leadership team, even though it doesn't always appear that way, or maybe one person kind of gets tasked with project managing it. But like, where does building a strong master schedule start before you jump into that Excel, Google Sheets template?
Yeah. Whether you're a school or a network, it starts at the really this time of year establishing strategic priorities for the next school year, and that's really breaking down what's your mission, what was our performance data last year against that mission, where are the strengths and weaknesses, and then using that information to define what's going to be most important in the coming year, because those strategic priorities are going to influence your instructional model. So it is, as you said, a real cross functional endeavor to say, at our school, at our charter network, what are we going to focus on? Where are we going to push our resources to move closer to our mission? And once that's established, it needs to translate into an instructional model. All the magic happens in the classroom. And so when I say instructional model, what I mean is that student and teacher experience, like what happens in a school each day. For an eighth grader, how many periods of math do they get, or how many minutes of math do they get? What curricular materials are used? Is it every other day, or is it every single day? Are they blocks? Are we 2 semesters or 3 trimesters? All of those things kind of make up the instructional model, should be informed by those strategic priorities. Because when you have the instructional model and then what we would call instructional parameters, they're kind of part and parcel. Those are the first and most important building blocks of a high quality master schedule. The strategic priorities in the instructional model, then the conversation I think does shift more over towards maybe operations and finance, and it goes to enrollment projections, and I mean real enrollment projections, not wishful thinking. When I was the COO at Mastery, we would take the trailing 3 years of enrollment data, we'd identify trends, we would then compare that against hyper local market conditions. So, are schools opening or closing in the area? What's happening with the school age population in your section of the city? Whatever those things are, that started to shape what our enrollment projection would be for the upcoming year. And then finally, we had to look back and interrogate our enrollment strategy and execution from the previous year and find out what worked, what didn't, and then what we needed to adjust for the upcoming year. So only after that process of, establishing strategic priorities, starting to build out and formalize that instructional model and parameters, and then going through that enrollment paces, can you really say, all right, we have an achievable enrollment target and we can move forward. And most of the listeners know that enrollment projections and enrollment drives revenue forecasts. So once you know that, your finance team and operations team, academic leads can come together and start to build a preliminary budget, adjusting for the expenses to align to those priorities and model.
What happens if schools get that wrong? You mentioned, having extremely realistic enrollment projections, really digging into the data that's local to your part of the city, your community. What's kind of the bear case if if you're overly optimistic on the enrollment side? What's kind of the downstream effect for operationalizing the master schedule?
Yeah, it's more common than you'd think. Schools end up overshooting their enrollment projections, and suddenly they've budgeted for particularly staffing that they can't afford. And that's because oftentimes they're setting targets not based on data and reality, but more often on growth plans. Hey, we said by 2027 we would be at this number, so we got to get back on track to that. Sometimes it's board expectations. Boards of directors have a vision for where a network or a school is going, and you can feel that pressure, all coming from a good place, but you can feel that pressure and want to inflate that number a little bit. There's also these, I would call them like Hall of Fame years. Well, back in 2017, we hit 700, and we should be able to do that despite the last few years maybe being at 600. Like, we should be able to hit that 700 number.
Right.
ESSER funds gone and healthcare costs ballooning. There's no margin for error, and we've got to get enrollment projections right, or else there's really difficult choices and decisions to make on the back end.
Right. And so if you follow that thread through, you might not be able to afford certain staff. You had slotted that staff in to cover, whatever your instructional model is. And then all of a sudden, when your projections don't hit where you thought they would, you're sort of backpedaling and having to make really difficult decisions, I would imagine, about program staff, et cetera, how you're going to survive.
Yeah, and that ultimately ends up being on a principal's plate. And they're the ones kind of looking at their staff and making, again, impossible choices. They didn't plan for it. And so
Right.
now they're going through and you're either closing a vacancy for a position you think you really need, or you're cutting another program. And the last thing you want to do is any sort of layoff or anything like that. But the decisions are difficult, and it makes it so important to go back and say, let's be very rigorous about how we set this enrollment target. Let's be real. Let me get all of the stakeholders in around the table so they can understand the complexity of this and the implications if we don't get this right, or we set some sort of aspirational goal. Not to mention, Daniel, you want to like steal the momentum or joy from a director of operations or APO, hand them an enrollment target that they know they can't hit.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, certainly demoralizing. Okay, so we've got our vision and mission, we've got our strategic priorities, then we've got realistic enrollment and revenue projections. What comes next? What's the next step in this process?
Yeah, I think once that preliminary budget is built, you're going to kind of swing back, likely in whatever role you're in. You're going to swing back and start to engage with talent in HR and also like the academic team, because at that point you're determining teacher allocation. You're taking this aggregate head count that you have, and you're starting to get really detailed about how many teachers you need in each content area. And here's what's critical: the allocation should be driven by strategic priorities and instructional model. I am going to beat that drum today.
What else might it be driven by? Like, what are some common give us the counter, like you know, the reality. If it should be driven by those things, what are some of the negative things that sometimes drive it? Is it just like the strongest personality in the room gets the most teachers, or what are some of the negative drivers?
Yeah, more likely just status quo.
Yeah.
We had this many, we've always had 5 ELA teachers, or we've always offered these art courses. And so it's typically there's efficiency and there's comfortability in just rolling over the model from the previous year, regardless of whether you actually met your goals or moved closer to your mission. But the task here and the way to make master scheduling a real leadership tool and strategic is to align those priorities and model to the or align the staffing allocation to those priorities and model. And let's just take an example to try to make this come to life.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let's say that your network wants to improve literacy outcomes in 6th through 8th grade. If your instructional model has been well defined and it's translated into those parameters we talked about, how many minutes, class size, all those things, curricular materials, all that, um, you can now start to say not just, hey, we need more time for ELA, or we need 5 periods of ELA. You can start to be really specific about certain class sizes, about who the teachers are who are going in certain places, how many days a week, all of those things. And it's going to allow you to just be more targeted and be real about, hey, if this thing matters to us, then we're going to protect the amount of time we need. We're going to get the right instructional materials. We're going to get the right teachers in there for a right amount of minutes to align with what we say is most important. And that requires each year going back and saying, all right, what do we need this year to be successful? It may be different from what we needed last year.
Right. So the strategic priorities get kind of baked in first, before, as far as prioritization, allocation of staffing, before you get on to, here's all the other things we did last year that need to fit in here somewhere. You're sort of starting with what's the top priority, and let's staff and allocate towards that, and then other things come after that.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly right. And there's no, you're of course not going to throw out what you've learned over the years, and you don't always have to go back to zero. We could talk about that, and maybe we will. But it is really about making sure that the most important thing stays the most important thing, and you're willing to make really difficult decisions to honor a priority that you know is true and know is necessary to get closer to the mission.
So who's actually doing the puzzle piecing here? Because as you were outlining that one micro example around ELA specific goals, it made me think of how many other goals there are, or how many other subjects and teachers and students are at different levels, and it's such a puzzle, and there's so much complexity when you start to think about all the moving parts. What's the next step in this process? Who's actually tasked with tackling this, and what does that look like?
Yeah, charter networks that do this really well end up with a sophisticated, data driven, really interdepartmental piece of work, and then it gets handed down to school leaders. And in the best case scenarios, it's handed to an experienced leadership team with experienced schedulers, and they can create a pretty efficient schedule because they've done it before. Too often principals and instructional leaders are playing outsized roles in that process. We'll get to that later in the conversation. But for many, that's the best case scenario, is what happens at the executive level or at the network level gets handed down to folks who are really equipped to say, I know how to do this. I've done it before.
Mm.
At worst, it goes to a junior ops team member who's going to work their butt off, but they're under resourced, they're undertrained, and they'll likely feel an unnecessary amount of stress and burnout trying to translate that budget and allocation into a master schedule that may or may not end up satisfying their school's leadership team.
Excuse me. Yeah, let's pause on that idea because I sort of envision the archetype being an ops manager or director of ops up late at night, fifth cup of coffee, pulling their hair out, and they've got sticky notes and an Excel file, and they're trying to put all the pieces together. To me, that's sort of the archetype of peak master schedule craziness. And I'm guessing people who are listening to this have lived some version of that reality. What is the alternative? You mentioned when things get handed over to experienced leaders, they know how to take it and run with it. What can this look like? And maybe talk us through, like, what are some of the right levers that experienced folks are pulling to make this work?
Yeah, the what you described is real. I've lived it. Many folks have lived it with everything that you described, including the fifth cup of coffee. But I want to go back to what I noted about instructional leaders, because what I've found is that some of the best schedulers and scheduling teams, the principals and assistant principals of instruction or VPs of instruction, are really involved in that, and for good reason. They understand the things we talked about best around strategic priorities, instructional models, and instructional parameters. But I think there's an important question to frame this entire conversation around, no matter who is the person who's actually manipulating the master schedule, building it from the beginning or getting it from the network and trying to piece it together in the middle of the night. We have to reflect and we have to kind of stare down the most recent NAEP scores and how our country's children are performing against their peers around the globe and ask ourselves, is this really how we want middle and high school leaders to be spending their time? Working with outdated tools, making impossible trade offs. When you have a whiteboard with sticky notes and a spreadsheet, there's little visibility into the impact of each choice along the way. Do we really want them to just be people putting a puzzle together? And I so appreciated. I had great partners at Mastery and along the way in Master Scheduling, and two of them, Dan Bell, who's the deputy CFO, and Peter Lee, who's the chief information officer at Mastery, deserve all the credit for this. They would talk about the idea that the master schedule is not the product, that the
Mm.
master schedule is a tool to support the product, which is great instruction. And that when middle and high school leaders spend excessive time building schedules, they're not in classrooms, they're not coaching teachers, they're not strategically planning for the upcoming year, and they're not spending enough time on instructional effectiveness. And I would say the same for ops leaders and school counselors, that there's higher impact work that they can be doing. But the antiquated nature and the weakness, frankly, of the tools on the market are leading to that middle of the night assembly.
Yep. It makes total sense. So the schedule is not the product, it's a tool, as you were just saying. The instruction is the product. We want great teachers in every classroom. And as you mentioned, spending hours and hours and hours in the weeds here is taking away from time better spent elsewhere. But at the same time, the schedule has to get built. The academic year has a way of churning on quickly, and before you know it, you're kind of like back in this process again. Um, what are some of the approaches or things you've learned on how people can do this in a manner that puts students first, but also doesn't take so much time off the leadership, and prioritizes the right things? Because I think there's a delicate balance there. And obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about the tooling side of this. but kind of like big picture, the schedule has to get built, someone has to do it. How can folks approach this in a way that is maybe different?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it really starts. We talked a little bit about the process from the network level, so we'll anchor this conversation and what's happening at the school level, and what those whoever is assigned to it, whether it's a VP of instruction or someone on the on the operations side, is building it. The first is to make sure that you work with your leadership team or your network team to ensure that those instructional parameters are in place and we're clear on priorities. Because if you start to go down the road of using other tools or following a timeline or process that will lead to the most efficient schedule, if you haven't clearly identified what the priorities for the year are in the instructional parameters, well, then you're just trying to assemble chaos, and what you're going to run into is a lot of conflicts, a lot of questions to be answered. Things like, hey, I know this is our teaching allocation, but you said you only wanted 25 students in a class. I can't make that work. It's either 25 students in a class, or we have to, have more teachers. And some of these, like, things that present themselves as either or are really kind of both and problems. And you'll never get rid of those in scheduling. There's always choices to be made.
Right.
But when you start from that point of being very clear about what your priorities are and your instructional parameters are, there's fewer of them, and it makes it easier to answer those questions. It's like leaning on values or leaning on a mission. The hard decisions don't go away, but you have something that can help inform how to do that. So the having the school-based leaders having that information so that they can start assembling that schedule or building it is really critical. But I would also say, to make sure, if we lift back out to like the network level, networks can support their APOs or whoever the schedulers are by having a process that lays out both kind of a kickoff and a way to get started on master scheduling that builds momentum and clarity, checkpoints along the way to make sure that they're on track, and then embedding support. We always prioritized at Mastery, at least in the last 5 years, having a kickoff where we brought all school leadership teams together, principals all the way through. There were counselors, everybody was there from a broader school leadership team. And we used it as an opportunity to say, hey, scheduling season's starting. Here's what matters most this year: priorities, parameters, the why behind those things. And then we gave schools dedicated time to start to plan out, what do our next 3 to 5 months look like? Think roles, responsibilities, deliverables, things like that. And then they walked out of that room feeling more empowered to kind of tackle, because they knew what was most important. They knew what the model was, and then they went off and built it. But when they go off and build it, certainly a lesson learned for me was, you need to install quality control checks along the way. And these are opportunities for network leaders to ensure that as the schedule builds, the priorities stay the priorities and are reflected in each evolving version of the schedule. Because when you're building a master schedule and you start to layer in constraints, the schedule starts to calcify, and there's fewer and fewer pathways. And that leads to those either or decisions that are made. And the problem is, those either or decisions are made with little visibility into the impact of that decision. And then you wake up one day and the master schedule looks nothing like you intended it to. So there's quality control checks, and then support at each step of that along.
And during those quality control checks, or sort of checkpoints along this process, you mentioned there's these different constraints that sort of force the schedule to kind of calcify at a certain point. Could you talk us through, for those who haven't done this themselves, but maybe are getting pulled into master scheduling for the first time, or know it's going to be put on their plate in the upcoming year? Like, what are some of the constraints that schools should be thinking about that are drivers here of doing this work well? Because I would imagine there's student centric constraints, and then there's staff centric constraints, and there may be other constraints, facilities, and there's all sorts of other factors. But just looking at sort of the student side and then the staffing side, what are the variables that as a network you all are either highlighting for your actual schools, or sort of saying like, look guys, these are the windows that we're operating in because these are our priorities, and here's what you need to work with, and here's some thoughts on how to get started.
Yeah, that's a great way to segment them into kind of student centric constraints and adult centric constraints. So, a student centric constraint would be something like, class size caps that ensure individualized support for students who need it. The adult side constraints are things like a teacher who doesn't want to teach first period, or, hey, I've always been in this classroom and I'd like to be in this classroom again. I get it. I totally understand. Teachers are human beings with preferences and needs. I was a teacher, and adult constraints are a reality in any workplace. But here's the tension: every time we negotiate an adult centric constraint, we potentially take away from what students need. And that means we're diluting the potency of getting the right student with the right teacher in the right class at the right time. And when a scheduler, the person who's responsible for this, has all of these preferences swirling and all this context for their school, Miss Johnson is going through a tough time. I really want to get her first period free. The department chair always wants all teachers in the same wing. They start making accommodations, and before they know it, the schedule is optimized more for adult convenience than student outcomes. And that's an unfair burden to put on the scheduler or school leader to make those judgment calls, especially when they don't have the tools to elevate the costs of those decisions as they're making them.
And when you say evaluate the cost of those decisions, are you talking about kind of modeling this out in a way that leverages technology? Because I would imagine one of the challenges is particularly if you're doing this, in Excel or the whiteboard, with strings and sticky tape, um, is kind of drawing those through lines of, if I make this decision, what's the cascading effect on everything else? Like that seems very challenging to me. Is that where the technology is going? And I don't want to jump too far ahead to kind of future state, but is that one of the use cases that you feel like technology is able to solve for?
Well, yeah, exactly right. Because all of those constraints do have to be attended to, and every school who's building build a schedule. And I was just building schedules this past spring and summer for a group of charter schools in Florida. You list out all of your constraints, and I don't mean to cast a dark cloud on adult constraints. They're a reality. They need to be in there.
Yeah.
They serve a purpose. But when you line up all of those constraints, and then you start to try to build the schedule, it's very difficult to pursue what I would hope is everyone's goal with a master schedule, which is you're getting 100% of students 100% of their core course requests. That's the job, is to get as many. If we assume that the courses that are there, all the things that we talked about earlier in the conversation are true about strategy and instructional parameters and all those things, once this starts to get built, the job is to get 100% of kids 100% of their core course requests and build the most efficient schedule for kids first. And again, then some of those needs are in there. The problem is that when you don't have technology, you make choices and you don't see the consequences of them. When you use technology, you can do things like model different scenarios quickly. Hey, what happens if we layer in this adult constraint? Does it impact class sizes? Does it create scheduling conflicts? You can start to see the trade-offs in real time and take different models of a schedule, compare them, and say, hey, which one actually is going to serve our mission the best? Which one is going to align most with our strategic priorities for the upcoming year?
Right. So for schedules that do get built, I want to put a pin in the technology conversation because I think it's super interesting and I want to come back to it. Um, but let's get into, like, once the schedule's actually built, there's thousands of charter schools across the country. Everyone's doing this process. I would imagine there's certain things that come to fruition that maybe weren't planned for. Somehow you missed it in the in the structuring process. inefficiencies that you're later identifying, hindsight's 2020. What are some of those inefficiencies or trade-offs that you see as common pitfalls or things that schools are dealing with once they actually build the schedule, that they're maybe reflecting on as they go into this next round of master scheduling?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things come to mind around inefficiencies in the schedule. Sometimes schools, and we can really look into course offerings, which I would say sometimes schools offer too much, an overwhelming number of electives. Again, all for the right reasons. They want to be competitive. We talked a little bit. I mentioned enrollment earlier. Enrollment is more competitive than it has ever been in the charter space. You have to draw families and students in. And oftentimes, especially as we get into the middle and high school grades, families and students are drawn in by electives and specialized program. There's almost an assumption that they're going to get quality core instruction, but hey, what else can you offer my kid to have them really engaged, excited about learning, and prepared for their post-secondary path? And so some schools end up offering too much and too many electives, and it doesn't necessarily match up with their staffing allocation. So that's one. I would say the second is there's the right courses are being offered, but they're offered in an inefficient way. So you start to look at your schedule and you say, hey, we have 5 sections of Spanish 2, and there's 20 students in each section. You could consolidate that down to 4 sections of Spanish with 25 students each and redeploy that teaching capacity elsewhere. Heck, you could have your back against the wall and say, we actually need to get that down to 33 students a class and 3 sections. And so you can go in and see efficiency, but there always has to be that backstop or that checkpoint against how far are we willing to stretch it. And when you have a clear instructional model and priorities, you really know what your boundaries are. But those are the kind of the type of efficiencies. Something that's interesting that I've started calling zero-based scheduling, and you would know this, Daniel, because
Yeah.
similar to zero-based budgeting. Instead of starting by saying, "Hey, we've always offered these 47 electives," you ask instead if we were to build our course catalog from scratch, knowing what we know about our priorities, student and family needs and wants, then what would we offer? And it forces you to justify every course based on current data and not tradition. And that's a hard thing to do because, maybe you've offered ceramics 3 for the last decade. But if there's only 12 students who have requested ceramics 3, and you have another, section of, let's say, modern art where we have 28 students trying to get in that course, it makes the conversation more objective and data driven and makes resolving those inefficiencies a little bit easier.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point because a lot of times you'll see, a new leader will come into an organization and then there's just, they become a catalyst for change and the organization's in a totally different place 2 to 3 years later. And a lot of times if you dig into that story of like what really happened, like yes, the person's an amazing leader and they brought in, maybe additional staff and things like that. But a lot of times it's the same people in the same organization and the school or business or nonprofit looks totally different. And a lot of times it's because that leader comes in and they just don't have the same kind of we've always done it this way. They're not worried about this relationship and this political issue on the board. And so they're able to take that kind of zero-based approach to everything and kind of ask first principles questions, which is what it sounds like you're really encouraging folks to think about. And it allows you to make the right decision that might be harder but has better lasting outcomes for the students as opposed to the decision that's going to keep one specific staff member happy. It kind of gets us back to that adult centric versus student centric when thinking about the constraints and the driver. So I think that's a really interesting framing for folks to consider as they're kicking this process off. What do you think the biggest on that topic of change? Like, I want to jump us into the future here a little bit. What do you think the biggest, and I'm sure you've actually heard this in your current role, pushback is to changing the way scheduling is viewed and approached? Like, what are people? What's the pushback to this? Because when I sit here and think about the operational complexity, like I would think leaders would always be chomping at the bit, like, please tell me there's a better and easier way to do this. Um, but what's the case against change?
Yeah. I would say the most common one is our school is unique and a standardized model or tool won't work for us. And
Mm,
you know what? They're partly right. Every school does have unique characteristics, but that doesn't mean you can't work from a common instructional model, a strategic foundation, and a really thoughtful scheduling process from beginning to end. Because the goal isn't to make every schedule identical; it's to ensure every schedule is aligned with your priorities and built efficiently. On the technology point, though, the other pushback can sometimes be against bringing in a tool because some people feel like, hey, I've been doing this for 15 years and I'm good at it. I don't need
right.
a tool. And I get it. There is pride in craftsmanship. But having led the adoption of Timely when I was the COO at Mastery, I would say, would you rather be good at manually building a master schedule, or would you rather be excellent at leading the strategic implementation of a master schedule? Technology doesn't replace human judgment in the scenario, it amplifies it and helps take the computational heavy lifting off so that our directors of operations and our APOs can engage in strategic leadership. And I made this a big point of my time in the COO role when at Mastery. Too often, our DOOs and APOs are considered doers by their colleagues, by central offices, by whatever else. They can do that strategic work. They need to be given the tools to do that strategic work.
So tell us a little bit more about where the tool development is coming, and you can speak to Timely and if there's other tools out there or innovation happening in this space, whether it be on the SIS side or otherwise. Tell us a little bit about like what is the tech enabled version of this, and how is it supporting? Let's maybe talk about the different layers of the cake we've been hitting on here, like the network level. I would imagine providing visibility and kind of oversight and modeling for the schools. They're actually doing the direct puzzle moving for their local community. How is tech helping organizations do this more efficiently, and what are some of the things you guys are building at Timely?
Yeah. As I've kind of hinted at a couple times, I joined Timely for many reasons, but one of them was I was an early adopter. We were looking for a solution at Mastery. Our former CEO Scott Gordon had identified some inefficiencies in our scheduling, both on the resource allocation side, but also on the how aligned we were to our instructional model. And I think we already did it really well at the time, but there was an opportunity to be even better. We were trying to improve our results, and we were thinking like, how can we make sure that every teacher that we invest in is in front of, I don't want to say always the most number of kids, but can be in front of students in a really strategic way, that that's where they're spending their time, and that all of the courses we're offering, the minutes, the curricular materials, class sizes, all of those instructional parameters are all working towards the same end. And so this challenge was in front of me around resource allocation, but also instructional parameters eventually becoming schedules, and not letting that kind of weed grow that I talked about before, where you start with the best of intentions for what your schedule is going to look like, and you wake up in August and it looks nothing like it because of how schedules just naturally calcify. You make those kind of either or choices, impossible choices with no visibility, and you're a little bummed out at the end, but at that point you just want to get to the finish line.
Right.
So Payman Ruhanafard, who's the founder of Timely, he and I had a relationship. He was the superintendent of Camden City Schools. He came into Mastery and showed us Timely, and this was 3 years ago. And I thought, wow, this thing's gonna really be a game changer for us. And there's two parts to it. It's a web based platform that has AI optimization, and what it does is it takes all those constraints that we are talking about, it takes all of the student course requests, and it starts building the models. And it's thousands and thousands and thousands of different iterations to say, if these constraints have to be true, then how can I get the most number of students the most number of courses. And ultimately, what it spits out is the most efficient schedule because it's just following those rules. And the thing that really tipped me over the edge was not necessarily the technology, but the hands-on support. So there's a dedicated school success manager who's someone who's done scheduling in the way we've talked about it, maybe more sophisticated too, but has done it in the old way that we've talked about it. And they're able to sit side by side with schools to make sure they not only understand the platform and can maximize it, but also that all of the kind of technical stuff gets through and can be a thought partner on the scheduling side of things. When we think about, technology in general, there's things about Timely, but, any other technology that I think have to be true for any network or school to say, "Hey, I want this as a solution, and it's actually gonna move me forward." And it's some of the things I've talked about. You have to be able to layer in those constraints, and the technology should do the heavy lifting of building the most efficient master schedule and concurrently optimizing for all of those student pathways. It has to be able to do that. It should also allow the visibility that you just talked about because that's going to allow for better support when network leaders can start to see what different models look like without, hey, send me that spreadsheet. Can you give me access to that spreadsheet? Hey, is that the first version or the second version? And then there's even the issue of, comparing one tab to another on spreadsheets. The process of master scheduling is so fraught with human error, and I'd still consider myself a scheduler, but technology does not get tired. The optimizer doesn't make these mistakes.
Right.
It doesn't make those errors, and so, again, to the point of let the technology do the heavy lifting, DOOs, APOs, networks, so that you can ask the right strategic questions about that schedule. And then lastly, on any sort of technology tool, it should save time. If the tool doesn't meaningfully reduce the hours and hours, days, weeks that are spent on master scheduling, then what's the point? And at Timely, we're seeing schools cut their scheduling time not by days, but by weeks.
So in 5 to 10 years from now, as the technology gets better, as AI continues to improve almost daily, this process gets, it gets compressed. Thousands of different variations are run in minutes. School leaders can ask really strategic questions like, what's the what's the long-term impact? Like what's the downstream effect of the tech the technology getting really good here?
Yeah, I think you're probably just going to see more dynamic and efficient scheduling. So instead of building one schedule or building a schedule once in the spring and kind of living with it all year, the implementation of technology should allow schools to adapt and adjust more fluently. There may be enrollment shifts, which are a reality. Student needs are evolving. We have far more students with IEPs, with multi-language learners. Like all of those things are leading to more complexity in schools, and therefore master schedules need to both respond to that when they're first built but also adapt along the way. So I think you're going to see technology that's going to allow for adaptation, both on the front end of the process and then in the middle of the process. I also think that we're going to see more transparency and accountability around scheduling. We talked about visibility a little bit at the network level, and that's going to be important to make sure that all those resources and all that intentionality around student outcomes is being delivered on in the instructional model in master schedule. But boards and authorizers might start asking more sophisticated questions about how resources are allocated through the master schedule as they look to turn over every stone around how to improve student achievement.
Yeah, I wondered about that. Some of the other, you know, the people who are invested in the success of the school, like it seems like this is a logical conclusion that others would want to be able to kind of see the through line between budget, strategic vision, budget priorities, what's the actual output into how we're structuring the day to day. So I think that certainly feels like a logical conclusion. Okay,
Yeah,
so
Daniel, I would say,
yeah, go.
one other note on that. Sorry to interrupt. Like,
No, please.
if you're on the kind of board and authorizer side of things, like if you're on a charter school board and you're approving multi-million-dollar budgets each year, you should understand how that budget comes to life in a master schedule. And I don't think boards and authorizers are often getting to that level of granularity. Are the strategic priorities that you're approving reflected in how time and people are allocated? That's a governance question as much as it is a mission or an operational one.
That's probably also the perfect question to kind of come to a close here on. I was going to ask you, for anyone who's in the thick of this or about to kick off their master schedule process, any final advice? I think what you just said there is probably a perfect kind of fundamental question. Anything else you would offer as final advice as we come to a close?
Yeah, it's scheduling season, Daniel. So I'm full of ideas. I'm excited about it because I do love this time of year. But first, I would just start by asking yourself, is your current approach to master scheduling aligned with your aspirations for instructional excellence? If you're a network leader who deeply cares about data-driven instruction, multiple pathways to and through post-secondary, and about overall student outcomes, but you're asking school leaders to build schedules with 15-year-old tools and fuzzy parameters, there's a disconnect. So invest in defining those model and parameters. It's foundational. It's going to make everything else easier. You can't optimize a schedule if you don't know what you're optimizing for. And then finally, be willing to rethink the process, whether it's zero-based scheduling or whatever it is. Just because you've always have done it one way doesn't mean it's the best way. The challenges our schools are facing with enrollment volatility, staffing shortages, increasing student needs are different than they were a decade ago. Our tools and our processes need to evolve too.
Perfect. Where can people learn more about Timely or connect with you, Matt?
Yeah, you can reach out to me directly. I think we're going to share my information. I am happy to talk through their current scheduling process, share what we've learned, explore whether Timely may be a fit, even if they're not ready to change tools. I'm always glad to connect with fellow charter leaders and talk about this work. We're all trying to do right by kids. We have to do something about those NAEP scores. And if I can share my insights from 20 years in this sector that'll help somebody else, then that's time well spent.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks again for sharing your expertise.
Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.